The factory floor stretched longer than 2 football fields, filled with the deafening roar of metal and machinery. Workers' hands were black with oil, their fingernails permanently stained from years of assembly work. The smell of gasoline and hot steel filled the air so thick you could taste it. In 1913, this building in Springfield, Massachusetts, produced more motorcycles than any other factory in the world, more than all competitors combined. The motorcycles rolling off this line were faster, stronger, and more beautiful than anything else on American roads. They won every race. They carried soldiers through wars. They made grown men weep with desire. This company didn't just dominate, it humiliated its competition so badly that most people thought the rivalry was already over. 50 years later, that same factory floor would sit completely empty, and the name that once meant victory would become a ghost story whispered among riders. How does the undisputed king of an industry vanish completely? Did they lose to a better competitor, or did something far more dangerous destroy them from inside? Chapter 1. The Bicycle Mechanics. Before Indian became the king of motorcycles, 2 men were simply trying to make bicycles go faster without pedaling. George Hendy owned a bicycle manufacturing company in Springfield, Massachusetts. He was a former bicycle racing champion who understood speed and engineering. But by 1900, Hendy saw something that troubled him. Bicycles were reaching their limit. No matter how light you made them or how good the rider was, human legs could only pedal so fast. Meanwhile, across town, a Swedish immigrant named Oscar Hedström was tinkering with something unusual in his workshop. He'd attached a small gasoline engine to a bicycle frame. The idea wasn't completely new. Several inventors across America and Europe were experimenting with motorized bicycles. But most of them were crude, unreliable contraptions that broke down more often than they ran. Hedström's approach was different. He wasn't just bolting an engine onto a bicycle and hoping for the best. He was redesigning the entire frame to handle the power and vibration of an engine. He was calculating weight distribution. He was solving problems that other inventors didn't even know existed yet. When Hendy saw Hedström's prototype running smoothly down a dirt road in 1900, he knew immediately what he was looking at. This wasn't just a motorized bicycle, this was the future of American transportation. The 2 men shook hands and formed a partnership that would change everything. They called their new company the Hendy Manufacturing Company, but the motorcycles they built would carry a different name, one that would become legendary. They named their motorcycles Indian, inspired by the image of Native American strength and freedom. It was a name meant to evoke the untamed American spirit. In 1901, the first Indian motorcycle rolled out of their small factory. It had a 1.75 horsepower engine, a top speed of around 25 miles per hour, and it actually worked. While other early motorcycles were temperamental machines that required constant repairs, the Indian started reliably and ran smoothly. Word spread quickly among the small but growing community of motorcycle enthusiasts. By 1902, Hendy and Hedström were struggling to keep up with orders. They moved to a larger factory and hired more workers. The Indian motorcycle wasn't just a novelty anymore. It was becoming a business. Chapter 2. Racing to Glory. When the first Indian motorcycle sputtered to life in 1901, neither George Hendy nor Oscar Hedström could have predicted they'd just created something that would dominate American racing for the next 2 decades. But Hendy understood something crucial about selling motorcycles. People didn't buy them because they were practical. They bought them because they were exciting, and nothing created excitement like winning races. In 1902, Hendy made a strategic decision that would define Indian's reputation. He entered Indian motorcycles in every race he could find. Dirt tracks, board tracks, endurance runs, hill climbs. If there was a competition, Indian was there. And they didn't just participate, they won, over and over again. In 1903, an Indian motorcycle set a new speed record. In 1904, another record fell. By 1905, Indian motorcycles were so dominant in racing that competitors started complaining the races were unfair. But Hendy wasn't interested in fair. He was interested in winning, because every time an Indian motorcycle crossed the finish line first, sales jumped. Every victory was free advertising. Every record was proof that Indian motorcycles were superior. Oscar Hedstrom continued improving the engineering. In 1904, he developed a new engine design that produced more power while staying reliable. Other manufacturers were building faster engines, but those engines broke down constantly. Hedstrom's genius was building engines that were both powerful and dependable. By 1907, Indian introduced the first V-twin engine motorcycle in America. The V-twin design, with two cylinders arranged in a V shape, produced significantly more power than single-cylinder engines. It became the standard configuration that would define American motorcycles for the next century. The factory in Springfield was expanding rapidly. What started as a small workshop now employed hundreds of workers. The assembly line stretched longer each year. Production numbers climbed from dozens of motorcycles per year to hundreds, then thousands. Indian wasn't just winning races anymore. They were winning the market. In 1910, Indian built over 4,000 motorcycles. By 1913, that number exploded to over 32,000 motorcycles in a single year. They were the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, not just in America, in the world. Their closest competitor, a small company in Milwaukee called Harley-Davidson, was producing less than half that number. Indian had achieved what every company dreams of: total market dominance. Their motorcycles were faster, more reliable, and more desired than anything else on the road. Police departments across America were buying Indian motorcycles. Delivery companies were using them. Regular Americans were saving up for months just to afford one. The Indian motorcycle had become a symbol of American innovation and freedom. Everything seemed perfect. The company was growing, profits were soaring, the brand was unstoppable. But hidden beneath all this success, cracks were beginning to form. Small decisions, seemingly insignificant at the time, were being made. Structural weaknesses were being built into the foundation of the empire. And the competitor in Milwaukee that everyone was ignoring was quietly watching, learning, and preparing to strike. Chapter 3: The World at War. In 1914, Europe exploded into the largest war the world had ever seen. World War I turned entire nations into battlefields and demanded unprecedented amounts of military equipment. Motorcycles quickly proved invaluable. They were faster than horses, more maneuverable than cars, and perfect for carrying messages across dangerous terrain. When America entered the war in 1917, the U.S. military needed motorcycles immediately. They turned to the two largest American manufacturers, Indian and Harley-Davidson. For Indian, this seemed like the ultimate validation. The U.S. government was placing enormous orders. Thousands of motorcycles were needed for the war effort. Indian's factory ramped up production to meet military specifications. They modified their civilian models for combat conditions. Reinforced frames, military paint, special equipment mounts. Indian motorcycles were shipped across the Atlantic by the thousands. They carried messages through French mud. They rode reconnaissance missions. They became as much a part of the American military presence as the soldiers themselves. Photographs from the Western Front showed American soldiers astride their Indian motorcycles, looking confident and capable. Back home, Indian used these images in their advertising. Their motorcycles weren't just machines anymore. They were patriotic symbols. They were helping win the war. Sales to civilians remained strong because the Indian brand was now wrapped in the American flag. But the war created a problem that wouldn't become obvious until it was too late. Indian had committed almost their entire production capacity to military contracts. The profit margins on military contracts were lower than civilian sales, but the volume was enormous and guaranteed. It seemed like smart business. Harley-Davidson took a different approach. Yes, they fulfilled military contracts, but they didn't abandon their civilian market. They kept their dealer network strong. They maintained relationships with regular customers. They balanced military and civilian production more carefully. When the war ended abruptly in November 1918, Indian faced a crisis. They had warehouses full of military-spec motorcycles that civilians didn't want. Their production lines were configured for military models. Their dealer network had weakened because they'd focused so heavily on military contracts for 2 years. But here's what Indian hadn't anticipated. Many of those soldiers had ridden Harley-Davidsons during the war. Harley had supplied motorcycles to the military too, and those soldiers formed brand loyalty. When they came home and wanted to buy a motorcycle, many of them went looking for the brand they'd trusted in combat. Indian scrambled to convert back to civilian production. They tried to clear out their military inventory. They offered discounts. They pushed their dealers to sell harder. But the momentum had shifted. For the first time since the company's founding, Indian wasn't growing faster than everyone else. They were struggling to maintain their position. Throughout the 1920s, the battle between Indian and Harley-Davidson intensified. Both companies were innovating, racing, and fighting for every sale. Indian was still the larger company. They still had the reputation. They still had the history. But Harley-Davidson was closing the gap year by year. Indian's leadership made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but would prove costly. They focused on building the most advanced, most powerful motorcycles possible. Engineering excellence was their obsession. If a feature added performance but also added cost, they added it anyway. Their motorcycles were magnificent machines, beautiful, powerful, and expensive. Harley-Davidson, meanwhile, was focusing on something different. They were building motorcycles that were good enough, reliable enough, and affordable enough to appeal to the widest possible market. They weren't trying to build the best motorcycle. They were trying to build the motorcycle that the most people would buy. By the end of the 1920s, the gap between Indian and Harley-Davidson had narrowed significantly. Indian was still ahead, but barely. The company that had seemed invincible was now in a real fight. And then in 1929, everything changed. What happens when the entire economy collapses? When customers disappear overnight? When two giants both face extinction? One company would make choices that led to survival. The other would make choices that seemed just as logical, just as reasonable, but would lead somewhere very different. Indian stood at a crossroads. The decisions coming in the next decade would determine everything. Part 2 reveals what happened when desperation forced impossible choices.